Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. My name's Shari Burke. I'm the Partnerships and Operations Manager here at Australian Organic. You're all very welcome on today's session on South Korea. Just to give you a brief overview of how today is going to work, we're going to start off with Asialink. We'll have Catherine Mudford, Kat Kang, and Liz Griffin speaking. Then we'll take a short break over then to Najib Lawn from Export Connect. And then our very own Josephine Pedersen will discuss regulation and have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box and enjoy the day. Thank you. Over to you, Asialink.
Thanks, Shari, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning. We would like to start this morning's session with just acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're present today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Many of you are possibly working from home like I am in Melbourne. So for folks who are in New South Wales and ACT, I wanted to acknowledge the Yalukit Willam clan of the Boon Wurrung people who are part of the Kulin Nation, which is where I'm working from today, and of course extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending online today. I'm Catherine Mudford, Director of Capability Development at Asialink Business, as Shari said, and I'll be working this morning with Liz Griffin and Kat Kang. I'm delighted to introduce Liz and Kat, who'll take on elements of our sharing session a little bit later this morning. But Liz is the Executive Director at the Australian Korean Business Council, which is a member-based organisation, and she's held that position since December 2015. Liz has extensive experience studying, living and working in Korea, so we're really delighted to have her with us this morning in the session. She is also a Korean speaker, speaking Korean at an advanced level. And she was recognised in 2017 by the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Sydney with an appreciation plaque for the work that she's done in promoting trade and investment between Korea and Australia. And I couldn't think of anyone better placed to share some of those insights this morning. I'm also delighted to introduce Kat Kang. Kat works with us at the Asialink team, but previously worked at the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency in Melbourne. And before that, she was based in Seoul, where she worked for a number of chambers of commerce, really bringing some deep insight into sort of Korean mindset, the opportunities to do business and bridge cultural differences, which is her passion. Kat has worked extensively across Malaysia, China, Japan, Canada, US before she arrived here in Australia, looking to build those cross-cultural bridges. So you'll have the chance to hear from Liz and Kat shortly. I also just wanted to reinforce just how happy we are here at Asialink Business to be able to work with Oz Organics to run this session. Asialink Group has been around for 30 years. Our work is really around how do we ensure Australia-Asia connection and engagement for shared prosperity and a shared future for us within the region. And we do that through a few ways. We do that through our connection with arts, through our focus on education and diplomacy. But Asialink Business itself has this really ambitious mandate of building an Asia-capable workforce. And so our work that we do together with Oz Organics, with you, is our chance really to contribute to that. We're looking forward to doing that.
I'm just popping out for a bit. Does anyone come? Yes, no.
So, as Shari said, there'll be a few parts to this morning's session. At Asialink, we're really looking to give you an overview of South Korea, introduce some frameworks that might help you when you're navigating working across cultures, and then really start to look into how you might understand the Korean mindset in a way that will help you better set up for success as you start to think about that as a market. think maybe, Kat, before we jump into Korea, I'd love to get a sense of who's on the call, who's on the webinar this morning. So we wanted to get a bit of a sense of your own experience to date. Some of you might already be doing business in Korea. Some of you might be working with Korean counterparts or partners. Some of you might have visited Korea for business or holiday, while others of you might not have had experience yet. So we'd love to get a bit of a sense of who's in the room and the experience that you have in Korea to date. So if you could just take a minute to select those responses that are most relevant to you. As I was getting ready to come into this webinar with you this morning, I was reflecting on the fact that, in fact, my last trips outside of Australia before we went into lockdown at the beginning of last year were to Korea, India and Singapore in one go. So I've got fond memories of that being the last place that I was before I was sitting here working from home. So I wonder if that might be similar for some of you too. Okay. So just taking a minute to let us know where what experience you've had so far. Some of you currently doing business, some working with Korean, or perhaps no experience with Korea yet. I noticed in the registration forms that many of you had mentioned other markets that you're working in, but hadn't mentioned so much of a focus on Korea yet. Let's take a look. Yeah, so that gels with what I'd seen for those of you who are registering. So, 3/4 of you telling us that you've got little or no experience. Someone's visited Korea on holiday and someone else has visited for business. A couple of you working with Korean counterparts, but on the whole, the sense of not too much experience yet. Well, that's a great place to start. Please use the chat box if you do have experience and expertise, just to share some of those examples with us. That'll be really helpful as we go through this morning. I guess just to set a bit of a scene, we talk about the Republic of Korea officially or formally, but more commonly known as South Korea. And for those of you who've come to this session this morning, it's probably because you know or are hearing that South Korea is a dynamic and vibrant place to do business. With a population of 51 million and a gross domestic product per capita in PPP terms of US 43,000, there's a lot of potential for Korea as a market. We signed the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement back in December 2014. And that's going a long way towards liberalising trade with Korea and creating new commercial opportunities for Australian businesses. The level of investment between Australia and Korea has grown significantly over the last 10 years as a result of some of those changes. And today, in fact, Korea is Australia's 3rd largest export market. And it's our 4th largest two-way trading partner. The companies wanting to take advantage of those opportunities, though, there's some complexity to understanding kind of the history and politics of Korea and the way that you might want to set up for success. And so this morning, we're going to have a chance to explore those factors with you. I'd like at this chance really to hand more formally over to Liz. Liz, could I hand to you to get us started in terms of that deeper dive?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Catherine. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. And for those of you who read my bio, I also used to work at Asialink. So this seminar today is of special significance. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at Korea in the region. So here you can see that the Korean peninsula comprises both South and North Korea. And it was really as recently as 1945 that Korea was one peninsula, but it was split into North and South following the Second World War. And I'll go into more detail about that a little bit later. As you can see here, the capital of South Korea is Seoul, and it's located quite close to the North Korean border. When we look at Korea's position relative to China and Japan, Korea often refers to itself as the shrimp among the whales. And if we look even further, there is a Korean proverb, 고래 싸움에 새우 등 터진다, which means in a fight between whales, the shrimp's back gets broken. Korea has suffered constant invasions throughout its history, including by the Mongols, China, and most recently by Japan from 1910 to 1945. And this plays a big part of their culture. And again, I'll explain this a little bit in more detail in a little bit later. This region as a whole is very interesting at the moment. Geopolitically, it's quite hot, it's quite contested. But if you look at it from Australia's trade perspective, as Catherine said, you've got a lot of Australia's top trading partners in this region. Korea is our third largest export market, and China and Japan are our top two trading partners. Next slide, please, Kat. So this map here shows the major cities of South Korea, and we might start by looking at Seoul. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it sits quite closely to the North Korean border. In fact, it's only 23 kilometres from the North Korean border. Seoul, of course, is the capital city of Korea, and it's really the economic heart of Korea. And I'm going to give you now a few stats to give you a sense of Korea's population density. So South Korea has a population of twice that of Australia, with 50 million compared to 25 million in Australia. Seoul's population is 10 million, double that of our largest city, Sydney, which is 5 million. But 50% of South Korea's population, so about the size of Australia's population, live in Seoul and the Gyeonggi province. Then if you drill down a little bit further, you'll see that South Korea's land mass is about half the size of the state of Victoria, with 70% of South Korea being mountainous. So these stats start to paint a picture of the lifestyle and the way that Koreans live. And as you can imagine, most Koreans live in high-rise apartments. There are not a huge amount of parklands or open spaces or clean and fresh air. So this is all very important context for you, particularly representing the organic sector, as we start to have a look at how Koreans live and what products they might be interested in. And in the absence of lush green parklands and open green spaces, food and diet plays a really important role for Koreans that are health conscious and looking for a healthy way of life. The other point I wanted to make here is that only 20% of Korea's land is arable, therefore meaning that Korea is a net food importer and heavily relying on countries such as Australia for their food requirements. And just quickly, we'll have a look at some of the other major cities in Korea. You have Incheon, which is the major international airport. So this is where, Catherine, you would have landed when you arrived in Seoul. It's about an hour-and-a-half drive from Seoul. Then you've got Busan down the south. That's one of the major port cities. You have Ulsan, which is a major industrial area. It's home to Hyundai Heavy Industries, which is a major shipbuilder and also manufactures a lot of cars. And also POSCO, which is a major steel producer in Korea. Then down the bottom, you have Jeju, which is similar to Australia's Tasmania. And this is a really popular place for holidays. And in fact, it's the airplane route from Seoul to Jeju is the most popular airplane route in the world, with flights leaving every 5 to 10 minutes. It's a similar distance between Melbourne and Hobart. And tourism really is the major reason for its popularity. It's a very popular holiday destination for Koreans. Now, there are slight differences among the regions in Korea, as I have described, but when you're looking at this from a customer or consumer preferences point of view, there isn't too much difference. And unlike some of the other countries in Asia where you may need to take into account some of these regional differences, this isn't really the case for Korea. If you are looking to travel to Korea for business, the one place that you must go is Seoul, given it's the economic heart of Korea, and there isn't too much of a need to travel to some of the other regions, except for, of course, tourism purposes. We'll now move on to demographics. And the first point on this slide here is that Korea is a very homogenous society. So even in Seoul, you won't see a huge amount of foreigners. If you go out to the more regional or rural parts of Seoul, it will be very rare for you to come across a foreigner. And the reason that Korea is quite homogenous is due to their past. As I mentioned at the start, Korea has had a very tumultuous history with constant invasions. And this has given rise to Korea's mindset of being quite cautious and wary of foreigners. This, though, we think might need to change, and the reason is due to the low fertility rate, or birth rate, as we might also call it. And this is having a devastating impact on Korea's demographics. So to maintain a stable population in a country, you require a replacement rate of 2.3. So on average, a woman needs to have 2.3 births to maintain a stable population. However, Korea has a fertility rate or birth rate of 0.84. So this means on average that a Korean woman is having less than one baby. For comparison's sake, our birth rate is 1.74. Now, in brief, the reason that Korea has such a low fertility rate is due to the fact that Korea doesn't have very generous maternity leave policies, which often requires Korean women to choose between having a career or having a family. Now, this, however, is improving and more government policies are coming into place to support women in the workforce. A key point for you to consider here as the organics industry is that because women on average are only having one child, they have more disposable income available for that child. Therefore, if we can clearly understand what the benefits of your product are for their child, they won't hesitate in spending the money for premium products such as organics. And the final point on this slide is about religion. Again, unlike other countries in Asia where you may need to pay special attention to religious-based traditions, that's not the case for Korea. We'll move along now to the rapid modernisation. And here you can see that Korea's economic rise since 1950 is nothing short of a miracle. At a glance, if you look at Korea in 1950, it was destitute, with many of the population homeless, little infrastructure. But if you look at Korea now, it is an industrial powerhouse, a soft power superstar, and home to many of the well-known Korean brands such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. Further, Korea is a member of the OECD, the G20, and it has the 10th largest economy in the world, ahead of Australia, which currently sits in 12th position. Korea is also the 8th largest exporter in the world. And this rapid economic transformation is often referred to as the miracle on the Han River, which I'm going to explain on the next slide. But with this economic transformation, Korea is increasingly open to influence from other countries, and Korean culture is becoming more westernized. We're now seeing a shift from Korean traditional food, which is typically healthy, plant-based with a small amount of meat, to now more Western foods due to the overseas influence. And also the impact of COVID-19 has many Koreans looking for a healthier alternative. So Koreans are very much open to new products and new foods that can enhance their well-being. They're also very curious and interested in learning about other cultures and foods. Again, meaning that your products, being Australian and organic, have a really good chance of success in Korea. So we'll now have a look at Korea's history and its economic success. One second. So here, I'm going to give you a very quick history lesson. Korea was occupied, as I mentioned at the start, by Japan from 1910 to 1945. It was then at the end of the Second World War that Korea was split into two. And that's because the Allied victors took control of the Korean peninsula, with USSR taking the north and America taking the south. Now, under these two different ideologies, it didn't work out too well. So North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, giving rise to the Korean War, which lasted 3 years from 1950 to 1953. Following the Korean War, Korea's GDP was less than $100 per capita. But today, as Catherine mentioned at the start, it's about $40,000. And one of the facts that Koreans are very proud of is that Korea has transformed itself from being an aid recipient following the Korean War to today being an aid donor. And it was really under President Park Chung-hee that Korea's economy began to grow. And the way that he grew the economy was to use cheap financing and tax incentives to support businesses that were able to export or substitute imports with domestically produced goods, called import substitution. And this strategy worked. While exports only accounted for 5% of GDP in the 1950s, in the 1980s, exports had risen to 35%. We'll now have a look at chaebols, which are family-owned conglomerates. And if you have a look at this slide, you can hopefully see a few familiar brands. You might have a Samsung dishwasher, a Hyundai or Kia car, or an LG TV. But what you may not realise is the sheer dominance of the chaebol on the Korean economy. And this slide shows that alone, Samsung accounts for 20% of Korea's GDP, which sounds great if Samsung has an excellent financial year, but it can also have dire consequences if Samsung doesn't perform well. We also refer to the chaebol as being like octopus-like in nature, as they have many tentacles in all areas of the economy. So as an example, we'll use Samsung. Samsung is not only involved in phones and electronics, but Samsung has its fingers in pretty much every industry. From hospitals, it has a university, clothing lines, department stores, biotechnology, semiconductors, shipbuilders, life insurance, advertising, theme park. You name it, Samsung will be involved in the industry. And without going into too much further detail, this has significant implications on the small to medium enterprises and startups, as Samsung and other conglomerates too often can control the whole supply chain. If we go even further, we can see that the top chaebols account for approximately 80% of Korea's GDP. Again, meaning that the Korean economy is largely dependent on the financial success of relatively few companies. And this is one of the reasons that Korean chaebol and Korean government are sometimes very closely intertwined, because the Korean government cannot afford for these companies to fail. Now, if we make this relevant to you in the organics area, I suspect that one of the main channels to market that you'll be looking at is department stores. And in Korea, there are four main department stores. First, you've got Lotte, you've got Hyundai, you've got Galleria, owned by Hanwha, and you've got Shinsegae, which is owned by the Samsung Group. So again, it's likely that you'll be doing business with these groups, and therefore very important for you to understand how they work and how they do business. If we look at this from another angle, which is employment, working for one of the chaebol companies comes attached with a lot of pride. So it's often the dream for a Korean university student to work for one of the Korean chaebol. Moving now to innovation. One of the fabulous statistics of Korea is that Korea was rated by Bloomberg as the most innovative economy in the world. And I think that this fact deserves a whole lot of attention. And there are two key reasons for this, of why Korea was ranked #1 in innovation. The first is R&D investment by government. As a proportion of GDP, South Korea spends about 5% on research and development. If we compare this to Australia, Australia only spends 1.8%. And the second reason for Korea having such an innovative economy is its ability to link, for industry to link very well with research institutions and academic partners. Again, this is something that I think Australia can learn a lot from. We're now going to talk about the impact of COVID. And Korea has taken quite a different approach to COVID than Australia, and its response is largely successful. In particular, it has not enforced any lockdowns, the economy has remained open, and so have its borders. COVID cases currently in Korea are approximately 2,000 a day, and this has been consistent for some time now. Current restrictions in place are that after 6 p.m, you can only gather with one other person, and from 9 p.m, all cafes and restaurants are closed. Now, while this doesn't sound too bad in an Australian context, this is significant for Korean culture, and in particular for business culture, as a lot of business is done after hours. In Korea, relationships are extremely important, and relationship building is often done after traditional work hours through dining and drinking. So it's customary for Koreans to gather with colleagues or clients for dinner and drinks, perhaps karaoke, about 3 or 4 nights a week. So therefore, these current restrictions, these COVID restrictions, are impacting businesses' ability to build and develop relationships. Another point here related to this is that Korea is a very collectivist culture. They love doing things as groups rather than meeting one-on-one. So again, these restrictions are impacting the ability for groups to gather. One thing to note, which is very important to your sector, is that while it is customary for Koreans to gather after working hours, which as an aside is often led by the eldest or the most highly ranked person in the group, the younger generation are starting to push back on this culture, preferring to spend time instead with their family, with their friends, or to pursue hobbies such as health and fitness. And there is a book in Korea which is very popular called 90년 대상이 온다, which literally translated means people born in the 90s are coming. And this refers to the younger generation being more vocal and less subservient to the older generation and the hierarchy. And this is also depicted in many of the Korean dramas, which I find a great way to learn more about Korean society and culture, and also encourage you to watch a few dramas or movies on Netflix if the Korean market is of interest to you. In terms of vaccinations, Korea is slightly ahead of Australia with vaccinations, and I'm also hearing that they are hoping to open up substantially in early October. We have our major conference at the end of October, and our Korean counterpart are confident that they will be able to conduct the conference and also the gala dinner in person in Korea by the end of October. We'll now move to e-commerce and start to have a look at a little bit more detail about your Korean consumer. Korea is one of the most connected countries in the world. They have one of the fastest internet connections in the world, and so much so that when Koreans come to Australia, they often remark that they feel quite frustrated at how slow our internet is. There's also enough free Wi-Fi in Seoul that if you really wanted to, you could get away in Seoul without buying data and just using free Wi-Fi. And almost everyone, including the older generation, have and heavily rely on their mobile phones. The Koreans are very tech savvy. They use their mobiles for everything, and they like to keep up with the latest trends. They also use their mobile for purchasing and prefer to purchase on their phone instead of their computer, and there are many ways that they can do this. They're also heavily influenced by social media marketing and also avid users of Instagram and YouTube. In Korea, it is part of everyday life, particularly for women who work, to do the shopping using e-commerce. And many women prefer these days to shop online rather than going to the bricks and mortar retail shops. Anecdotally, amongst my friends, many Korean working women in Korea do 100% of their shopping online. And this is possible due to very short delivery times and also every department store in Korea having their own app. Koreans also pay significant attention to comments and reviews, and this forms a major part of their decision-making process. So you must pay particular attention to the comments and reviews from your product. So in short, using e-commerce is a really important consideration for anyone looking to do business in Korea, and something that you must get right.
And I'll be taking over on this side, and I'll be introducing some key online platforms you have to know when you're considering business in Korea. And I'll start with the first two on the top left, Naver and Kakao. So you can think of Naver as being Korea's Google. In Korea, instead of saying Google it, you would say Naver it. And around 60% of the Korean population use Naver on a daily basis. And its endless features include payment services, real estate brokerage, and nowadays you can even view and reserve available COVID vaccines in different locations. A popular feature on Naver is comparing prices on different e-commerce platforms, and it operates its own online shopping mall for smaller merchants or businesses called Smart Store. Kakao, the yellow logo over here, is mainly a messenger app that is used by almost everyone that has a smartphone. And I often use it for work to communicate with stakeholders and clients. And even my 80-year-old grandma uses it to communicate with me. So you can shop goods also through the Kakao shopping feature. And you're also able to send gifts, including fresh groceries, coupons, and even a Gucci bag if you wanted to. Now let's go into the key e-commerce retail specific platforms. And there'd be Gmarket, Coupang, and Auction that are some of the major players of the e-commerce industry, and they operate quite similarly to Amazon. Market Curly over here is a relatively newer platform focused on fresh groceries, and a key platform for the organic industry would be the Oasis Market, which focuses on affordable organic products. I do want to highlight again that Koreans have very high expectations for fast and trackable delivery, and same day or latest next day delivery is the norm. For example, Market Curly was successful because they launched their early morning delivery service. So if you place an order before 11 p.m., it will be delivered by the time you wake up in the next morning, ready for you to cook breakfast. And this is possible because Korea is a very densely populated country, which enables delivery trucks to cover shorter distances per day. So now I'm going to look at the perception of Australian products in Korea. So Australia has a great reputation for high quality products. And when describing Australia, the word 청정, which means pure and clean, almost always follows. The image of Australia is having blue skies, clear waters, and vast green land. And I think this burger ad is a fairly accurate visual representation of the perception of Australia. The main focus and selling point here being that the patties were from cows in Tasmania, where it has undamaged natural environment and the cleanest air in the world. I want to go into another example of the image of Australia being used in a Korean ad. So when Koreans think of Australian beer, they don't think of Victoria beer. Can tell I'm based in Melbourne. For Exler Coopers, they think of Terra. It's actually a Korean beer label. The premise is that they're the 청정, the clean and pure lager, using 100% 청정 malt from Australia. For your reference, Terra is one of the most popular beer to drink nowadays, and it only launched 2 years ago, but has absolutely captured the market share. But if you look at the ad here, it's saying we're now living in an age of fine dust and pollution. And this beer brand they've traveled all the way to the other side of the world and have found clean and pure malts from the Golden Land. And they say 100% Golden Triangle malt from Australia, Terra. And I think this ad is a great representation of, first, the everyday concerns Koreans have on health and pollution in general. Just like we talk about the weather every day, many Koreans will talk about PM 2.5 fine dust levels and air pollution. Secondly, how there's so much demand for healthier products, even in alcoholic beverages. And third, the power of Australian branding for healthy and high quality products. Now let's look at the interest in organic products in Korea. As you can see in this chart, the retail value in the Korean organic market has experienced steady growth over the years. Korean consumers are particularly sensitive to health and wellness claims, and there are health trends and fads changing almost every year. So when I was living in Korea 2 years ago, it was noni, this tropical fruit and krill oil supplements that dominated. But now that craze has subsided and I think they've moved on. And my sister recently told me that it was green-lipped mussels that were popular these days. But organic products have always been associated with health benefits and for being nutritious. And especially with COVID, the demand for organic goods associated with health and wellness have increased even further. Younger mothers in Korea are known to be very particular about food for their children, and they form the majority group of consumers for organic food and beverages. And according to the Korea Rural Economic Institute, the top 2 reasons for consumers buying organic goods were because they believed it strengthened the immune system and that it improved skin conditions like atopic diseases for children, as pesticides and other harmful chemicals are not used. Korean consumers are willing to pay up to 40% extra for organic, and they do expect organic to be priced higher. And high prices have not deterred overall demand. I'll now hand it over to Catherine to overview the next session of the Korean mindset.
Thanks, Kat. And I guess what Kat and Liz have done is help give us a bit of a sense of the context which you can expect to see in Korea. And we wanted to spend a little bit that now just sharing with you some frameworks, thinking, given that context, when we're thinking about being successful, part of what will shape what's done and how it's done is then the cultural expectations in Korea. And so let's just look at a model or a framework that might be useful for us. So some of you have heard me mention the word cultural intelligence or CQ, and it builds on our understanding of if IQ is really our intellectual capability, our cognitive capability, and EQ is our social awareness, our emotional quotient. You know, cultural intelligence is really that ability to navigate quite different cultures and understand what shapes behaviors and perceptions. And of course, it's really tricky. We can't know every single culture. It's impossible to learn all of those off by heart. But what we can do is use a framework which helps us think about how do we watch and notice what's important, and how do we adapt what we do in order to be more impactful in that culture. And so this cultural intelligence framework here is a way of thinking about what might be useful. And the first thing that people who are really great at working cross-culturally do is they notice what's going on in a different culture. So we just call that's the knowledge of culture. So I'm looking, I'm reading, I'm noticing that culture. The second thing that people who are really good at operating in different cultures do is they get curious. So I've noticed all of that and I'm curious about why. I'm not going to judge it, I'm just going to watch it. And I'm curious about what that means then in terms of, you know, who's important here, how decisions get made here, how people like to communicate. And the third thing that people who are really good at working across cultures do, given that, is they make some decision around how they are going to respond given that. So that's the now what. And that's all that we would encourage you to think about as you're getting ready to work with a culture that's different from your own is, what do I know? What am I reading, seeing? What am I curious about? So what's the impact of that? And how might I adapt what I do in order to be more impactful? Another way that we often think about getting to understand different cultures in a bit more detail is the iceberg model, the cultural iceberg. So I always smile it's one of those things that's useful in lots of different contexts, isn't it? Because with that iceberg, 10% of what we see is above the water. That's really simple. But what's really going on is often not as easy to see and sitting below the surface. And Liz, I wonder if you might join me for a minute to think about what that iceberg looked like for you. You were relatively young when you first went to Korea, maybe 16, and in your late teens as a student. What did you notice above the surface when you first landed and arrived?
Yeah, so I might share a few examples if I can. I might share a few in a social context and then a few from a business context. First, from a social context, I noticed that women and men held traditional roles in the family. So the mother would typically be responsible for preparing the meals and looking after the children, and also ensuring that the children grew up with a really strong education, whereas the father typically went to work and didn't do a lot of that child rearing responsibility. His sole purpose really was to go to work and to earn the money. Another example I can give you is around the food. Unlike Australia, where we have our individual portioned meals, in Korea, traditionally I found that all the food was placed in the center of the table. You got your own chopsticks and spoon and a little bowl as well, but all the food would be placed in the middle of the table, and you would then just dish out what you would like into your individual bowl. I also noticed that because Koreans perhaps live in apartment buildings and have smaller homes than what we would expect in Australia, they did a lot of the entertaining outside of the home. So they went to cafes, restaurants to meet up with friends rather than inviting their friends into their homes. In a business context, I'll give you two examples. First, when I arrived at work in the morning, the first thing that I did was to greet my teammates and in particular my boss. I would go drop my bag, and then first thing I would do was go to his office, bow and say, "Good morning, how are you?" And the second example I can give you is lunchtimes, again, a food example, but it was expected that you would share your lunchtime with your team every day. If you had another commitment, that would be absolutely fine, but otherwise there would be an expectation that you would spend lunch with your colleagues. Of course, the boss most often would choose which restaurant that you would all go to, and this would be paid for by the company. This was a part of the culture that I particularly liked, but very different to the Australian culture.
Those are great stories, Liz. Thank you for sharing those. And I love that you're just sharing what you saw. Kat, I'd be curious, Liz has shared what she saw. What was happening underneath the surface? What are perhaps some of the values, assumptions, or beliefs that drive those things?
Thanks, Catherine. So kinship-based hierarchy and the importance of status have always been constant features of Korean society. So in Korea's last dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from 14th to 19th century, Confucianism was the state ideology. And although very few Koreans will say they follow Confucianism now, values such as prioritizing the collective good over individual rights, defined hierarchical roles, depending on age, gender, and seniority, for harmonious relations, and tiered interactions based on this hierarchy underpin and still influence Korean behavior and thinking. And I want to focus on one cultural concept that I think captures the essence of Korean society, and that's uri. And this might explain some of the things that Liz has experienced back in Korea. And uri means we and our. And in Korea, we often say we or our instead of I or my. So our and my are used interchangeably, and people will say our country and our school to refer to my country and my school, even if we are not from the same country or go to the same school. And we'll go as far as saying our husband, even though we obviously don't share the same husband. And saying my almost seems like you're possessing it on your own, or assume that the other person doesn't have the same ownership or experience. It almost seems egocentric. And saying Uri expresses this shared connectedness and how the self is always in relation to the whole. And I think it is this collective consciousness that has enabled the Korean people to endure some of the toughest times in history, including the Korean War, and also the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when around 3.5 million everyday Koreans voluntarily came forward to donate and sell their gold jewelry, wedding rings, trophies to help repay the IMF debt. So making personal sacrifices for the good of the country. That's also why the next concept of face, chaemyeon, especially in Korea, is not just an individual face, but a collective face. So Koreans will try to avoid shameful situations and preserve reputation, not only for themselves, but also for the extended community. However, I think it is important, as Liz mentioned, to note that younger Koreans are increasingly individualistic and are starting to reject traditional notions of hierarchy and gender roles, but in general, still highly value respecting elders and also taking care of family. So I'm going to be looking at the key considerations in understanding Korean culture. First of all, Koreans are very proud of their unique cultural heritage, including their history, language, and now K-pop, K-drama. So I would try not to draw parallels with its neighboring countries and acknowledge it for its uniqueness. Many Koreans also take pride in their rapid economic success, particularly, as Liz mentioned, the transition from being the recipient of foreign aid to a donor. And as hierarchy is important, you may be asked your age or your job title first to establish seniority. And you'll find that once that is established, the interactions will change to reflect that seniority. You'll also see that the decision-making will be done by the person with the highest authority, and junior employees will probably only refer back to the decision made by the person with the highest authority. Here, I also want to emphasize the importance of education and occupation here. Where you went to university is extremely important and something that will define you for your entire life. So competition to get into the best school and to get into the top jaebol companies, you can imagine, is very intense. Next point here is modesty and humility are highly valued. So try not to oversell yourself, talk about your achievements, even if you've worked really hard for it. Let someone else do the talking for you to build your face. Also, Koreans are generally very hard workers. They expect fast results and will work really hard to achieve them. You'll also often hear 빨리 빨리, which means quickly, quickly in Korea. And the fast-paced tendency can be seen everywhere. Like the internet speed, the delivery speed to the country's growth. Next point is make sure to be polite, greeting properly with the bow, making sure you're bowing lower than the person of higher status. If you're receiving something from someone using both hands, these polite, respectful gestures will show that you're a good, well-educated, respectable person. And Liz, I'd like to invite you back to hear, out of these considerations, which ones were easy for you to adapt to and to follow, and which ones were challenging as an Australian living in Korea?
Great question. And I think all of these things are so different to Australian culture. It was really interesting for me, as Kat mentioned, to kind of sit back and just watch this culture unfold. For me, probably the top-down decision-making hierarchy was quite interesting to me, again, just to watch this unfold and people bowing at different heights and lengths and the respect that people were always showing to each other. It was just fascinating to watch. And I remember when my parents came to visit me, I had to duck out for a business meeting, so I just left them at Starbucks. And I came back and Mum just said, "Oh my God, we've just been people watching for 2 hours and it's so fascinating." So there's so much that you can uncover just by watching. But to go back to hierarchy, this again I think is something that needs to be really well understood by Australians that are looking to do business in Korea. As you mentioned, Kat, I think in a personal setting, age really determines where you fit in the hierarchy. And as you say, it's not uncommon for Koreans to straight up ask you, Kat, how old are you? And that's not a rude question. It's really just to determine where you fit in the hierarchy. Are you older than me, Kat, or are you younger than me? And if so, how do I change my behavior and my body language to you to demonstrate that respect? Or how should you change your behavior to demonstrate that respect to me if I'm older than you? So these are just really interesting things that you really should understand and try and pick up and use as you try and do business in Korea. In more of a business setting, rather than age, it's more determined by your title and your position. And again, this really needs to be well understood when doing business with Koreans. As an example, decisions are typically only made at that top executive level. So you can't expect someone down in the working level to be in a position to make decisions. And this has consequences in terms of the length of time that it takes to get a decision in Korea. So whereas you might start your relationship at the working level, you might make a proposal or a request. This then needs to go up multiple layers of hierarchy to the top layer of hierarchy, the top executive, to make that decision. So all of this requires consensus building, consultation, report writing at each layer of the hierarchy before a decision can be made. And that's why typically in Korea, decisions can take quite a long time. But I do note here that once that decision has been made, things happen extraordinarily quickly. And that's where the bali culture comes in. If I could just make one more point on this slide, and you mentioned it, Kat, is the importance of education. And if we think about why education is so important in Korea, it's really due to the fact, well, Confucianism, of course, but also in terms of their natural resources. South Korea doesn't have a lot of natural resources. So they've had to rely quite heavily on education as their pathway to economic success. And if you get into one of the top 3 Korean universities, which is Seoul National University, Korea University, or Yonsei University, SKY for short, you're almost, as you said, Kat, you're almost guaranteed success in Korea. And due to this, Korea has one of the most highly educated populations in the world. And in fact, I think the studies for the cohort of 25 to 34-year-olds, Korea has the most highly educated population in this cohort amongst OECD countries, with about 80% of Koreans obtaining a tertiary education. They also spend, in terms of the organic sector, trying to link this back to our group today, Koreans spend a significant amount of money or disposable income on their children's education. And Koreans would stop at nothing to give their child a better education. So as an example, when I did a homestay in Korea, the kids, I think, were about 9 and 7. They were relatively young, but they would go to school during school hours. Then they would come home, but then they would go to these private education institutes called hagwons. And they would come home after school, then they might do a hagwon on English. So they might go to an English school for an hour, might then go to a math school, and then they might come home, have dinner, and then they might again do a science lesson online, and then they might do a music lesson online, and then they would quite often stay up until about 12 o'clock each night studying. So the consideration for you here is, given how the emphasis on education by the Korean population, can your product, can you promote anything in your product that demonstrates that it can improve, say, brain health or concentration levels, or linking that back to better education results and outcomes could be a good benefit for you to consider.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Kat. And I should imagine, as many of you are listening to that conversation, some thoughts around what might be similar and different between Australian and Korean cultures are probably coming up for you. And I wanted to share a simple framework that we have been using in this webinar series, which is really a way of helping you map and think about those differences. Because although we might assume we're speaking the same language when we go into a meeting, it becomes really apparent that our different cultures have given us some different views around what will and won't be appropriate when we go into that business meeting. So being able to interpret from somebody else's perspective will be really helpful in terms of ensuring you set yourself up for success. So just a quick run through of those 5 dimensions. This tool is called Globe Smart. There are many tools that help us think about understanding and navigating different cultures. Globe Smart's great because it really comes from a business perspective in the sense of what are the things that we would like to do in terms of decisions that to be taken, communication that needs to be had, and the way we do things, and has simply brought together, decades of research from other researchers and consolidated that to identify 5 key dimensions. So that first one, we've been hearing quite a lot about it. Cultures either have a preference to be more independent. So there's a lot of importance put on individual identity and our own personal achievements and becoming ready to be independent and be able to operate on your own. Or on the right-hand side, cultures have a focus on more interdependent ways of being. So a greater focus on group harmony, a greater focus on cooperating together, and the group and being affiliated to the group is more important than what happens at an individual level. So I'll give you a quick, you can have a think of that based on what you've heard Liz and Kat saying and sharing where you think Korea might fit and where you might fit in Australia on that continuum. The second dimension is really related to hierarchy. So on the left-hand side, in cultures which are more egalitarian, we tend to see people as being pretty much the same, having an equal opportunity to contribute, and they should, and they're expected to contribute equally. On the right-hand side, in cultures which are more status-oriented, there is a set of rules which determine where the power sits, how decisions should be made, so that there are folks or roles, titles, experience within the group that would be valued more in the sense of who would have the biggest say. So have a think based on what you see in Australia, what you see in Korea, where you might plot those 2 countries culturally. The third dimension is really a dimension around how comfortable we feel with uncertainty. So there are some cultures where we're relatively comfortable with the unknown, not having all the information, having partial information is enough to take a decision. There are other cultures where it's far more important to have as much information as you can to ensure that there's less uncertainty, that all of the knowns that can be known are made known before we take decisions. So again, I guess just having a think about what you've heard from Liz and Kat, where Korea might sit and where Australia might typically sit. The fourth dimension that we think about is, level of directness. So we have some cultures on the left-hand side which are pretty direct. So in direct cultures, we say what we mean. We call a spade a spade. We're very black and white in terms of how we communicate. Cultures which are less direct, it's not appropriate to say what you think necessarily. It's the words, but it's much more than the words, and what's not said is as important as what is said. So again, having a think, what might Australia look like, what might Korea look like on that continuum based on what you've heard. And then the final dimension there in this mapping is what we call a basis on which trust is built. So some cultures build trust based on whether you do what you said you would do. So I'm going to build trust by delivering on my promises, by taking actions, and when I do those things, that means you'll trust me. For other cultures, it's much more, I'm going to start with the relationship. So I'm going to get to know you. Then we can work together. That's the way that I'm going to build trust. So I'd love just to pop up 2 country profiles, if I may. And if you were playing with me as at home, as you went along, or at the office, I'm wondering if your map looked like that. So you might see that we've drawn this profile of Australia where our focus is pretty much on the individual. You know, we raise our kids to be out of home by 18 and off, you know, into their flats, living independently. That's a sign of success. If we look at what we see in Korea, you can see on the right-hand side, there's, you know, as Kat said, that use of the word uri. The focus is on we, and it's really around a collective way of being. Right down that left-hand side, we see Australia as far more egalitarian. Everybody has a say and everybody should be treated equally. We're pretty comfortable with acting without everything that we need, being able to operate in the moment, on the fly. We expect to be relatively direct in terms of the way we give feedback, the way we talk to folks. What we say is what we mean. And we think people will know us, respect us, want to work with us if we demonstrate what we can do. Liz, can I ask you, because we're looking at the fact that there's some real big differences between what we prefer in Australia and what we see in Korea. And I'm looking at that biggest difference on that second dimension, egalitarian and status. Would you like to share with us how, you've given us a couple of examples, how you see that playing out?
Sure. So I think this relates back to hierarchy. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand how hierarchy plays out in a Korean context before you start doing business with Korea. So just as an example, sitting here in Australia on the hand side of this table, I feel very comfortable calling my chairman without any notice, just giving him a call and saying, hey, I need your help with this. Can you please help me? If we're sitting on the right-hand side in Korea, that wouldn't be the case. You would need to go through multiple layers of hierarchy. You might need to do a bit of consultation with your peers and then with your seniors. You might even need to write a report or prepare a report about what the agenda would be and what you would like to discuss with the chairman. So hierarchy is extremely important in Korea, and it's incredibly important that you don't break the hierarchy. You need to know where you fit in, and you need to stick with that hierarchy and stay in your lane, as you say. And that goes back to what Kat said earlier in terms of face. And you don't want to make anybody lose face. And of course, you don't want to lose your own face. And that could be quite disrespectful if you do break the hierarchy and jump an extra spot. So it's really important to understand who you're dealing with in Korea. If it's your counterpart, where do they sit in the hierarchy? Who's the boss? Who's the junior? Who will do most of the talking? And also who has the decision-making authority? And then we can link this back to the bottom one here, which is relationship. And it might take you a few dinners, it might take you a few lunches, it might take you a few sessions to really build that relationship with your Korean counterpart to determine that information, that status information, the hierarchy, who fits where, and understanding that. So these are all very closely interlinked, and it's really important that you do, when you do business with Korea, understand and respect also these three ways of building trust with your Korean partners.
Thanks, Liz. So it sounds like, compared with perhaps some of the ways we might typically work in Australia, it takes a little bit more detective work and a lot more time than we might typically have put aside for those kinds of things.
That's absolutely right. And I think that's one thing to stress to all of the people on the call, that if you are looking at the Korean market, don't expect a quick win. It will take a long time, and it will take a pretty big investment too, in terms of getting over to Korea, meeting with several different people several times, taking a few trips to Korea and really taking the time to build that relationship. And also from that senior executive level, don't expect to just send the most junior person. You will need to demonstrate that your company and your executives are behind your Korean strategy, and they will expect to see your executives fly to Korea to really build that relationship and show your commitment to the Korean market. So it's not a quick a quick fix. It will take time, but it is a really promising market, and I think there's a lot of potential for a lot of Australian exporters to do well in the Korean market, but it does need to be done well, and again, that takes time and investment.
So I guess just to sum up quite quickly what we might see, as Liz has said, none of those, the dimensions work together. And so when we think about culture, it's important to think about what's the overall map that you might expect to see. So in Western cultures, and obviously in Australia as a Western culture, we're typically direct and to the point. In Korea, we can expect that communication will be more indirect. There'll be more non-verbals, so watch the face, look at body language, look for what else you might be able to uncover and what are some of the implied meanings that are important. In Australia, we value being forthright, calling a spade a spade. In Korea, they'll value seeking out the views of others, making sure that there's some common consensus before we speak. In Australia, we're quite comfortable with being assertive, with disagreeing, stating our point of view. You're not going to hear direct disagreement in Korea. In Australia, we are very focused on practical ways of quickly getting what we need. You've heard Liz and Kat both talk about there's a need to ensure that, there's face saving, that we don't embarrass or others or ourselves or the group, and so that we'll take other actions that might ensure, they might not be the most practical and most direct, but will ensure that happens. And I guess the final point there is just that degree of informality. As we were getting ready for this webinar this morning, we were talking about where we were sitting and what we were wearing, and there was a lot of comfort with the fact that we were relatively informal in the way we were coming together this morning. In Korea, it's much more formal and paternalistic in terms of the roles are more clearly defined in terms of who has how within the culture. I wanted to share a quick image, and Liz, one of the things that we often hear from organisations that have started to work in Korea is that they've come away from a meeting feeling pretty positive. I think that meeting went well. I think that's a good opportunity. I feel like we're really going to move ahead. And then there's a huge disappointment when actually that doesn't happen. And these images, I guess, are one way of sort of showing on that left-hand side, our Western and Australian preference for being pretty direct, saying what we think, and perhaps expecting others to do that too. And I love the images on the right, that much more, the walking through the maze, the walking around the elephant in the room. Tell us how we might be able to deal more effectively, Liz, with this desire to avoid conflict, the indirect Korean communication style.
So this is so true. I have a fantastic colleague who's Korean, and I must say that I often use her to review my emails because I tend to be very left and straight and to the point, whereas she has this ability to word an email that is so soft and gentle but still conveys the same point, that no, sorry, we're not going to proceed, but she can do it in a much gentler and softer tone than I can. And again, Koreans wouldn't normally say directly no to your face. They'll find other ways to say no without actually using the word no. And I have a great example in which I work quite closely with the Korean embassy here in Australia, and my counterpart at the embassy, whenever he wants to say no but doesn't want to say no, he goes, Liz, that might be difficult. And that's a great way. Whenever I know he says that, I know that whatever I've suggested is not going to happen. Other phrases that they might say could be that might be challenging, maybe another time, or I must consult with my superiors. So just keep an open ear as to what they're trying to convey, but it is very unlikely that Koreans will be as direct as we are and say no straight up.
Great, thanks, Liz. Liz, we're just getting to the end of our session this morning. I wonder if you and Kat might share some final tips then to help our organisations think about their entry into Korea.
Great, thank you. So, Kat, I might ask you if you could help us by explaining the importance of learning a few phrases. And here we have hello and goodbye and thank you. Could you take us through those quickly, and also what you feel is the importance of learning a few Korean phrases?
Of course, thanks, Liz. I just want to, before I go into these phrases, I do want to note like the Korean language has a system of honorifics that reflects hierarchy. So how you say hello will be so different whether you're talking to a friend, somebody younger than you, or to somebody very senior to you. So for example, hello, which in a casual sense is 안녕, you would say 안녕하세요 to somebody that's older. But if you want to go even more formal than that, you can say 안녕하십니까, which shows even more respect. And it even matters if you're in a casual context, even if a person is only 1 year older than you, you would be using the more formal way to say hello, which is 안녕하세요. And for thank you, it's 감사합니다. And you'd be using this amount of formality when you're in a business setting, no matter when you first, establish that relationship. Even if you know that person is younger than you, you'll still be using that formal language when introducing yourself and when you're conversing.
Excellent. And what about when you address somebody in Korea? So if we say maybe Catherine is an example, you're a director at Asialink Business. So how would, if we were in Korea at the moment, how would you address Catherine?
So when I address Catherine, first of all, I would never call her by her first name. So I wouldn't say Catherine. I would most likely say Mudford, the last name, and then her position, director. And then I would also use 님, which is a way to honor somebody in their position. So it'd be Mudford 디렉터님. And for example, Liz, her title, I believe in Korean, is 대표이사님. I would be calling her Griffin 대표이사님 to refer to her in a business setting.
And so what would you recommend some of the businesses that we have on the line today? Do you recommend that they use also that Korean style of calling somebody, or how would you navigate that?
I think if they know that you are from Australia, I don't think that would be the level of expectation that they would have on you. And I think as long as you say the position title, so for example, director, Mudford, I think that would be good enough. And I think that they would really respect that. But if you really want to go a step further and show how much you're really interested in Korean culture, you could try that last name, position plus 님 and see how that goes.
I think you'd be very surprised and very taken aback and pleased to hear that you're trying.
Exactly.
I definitely recommend doing that. And just to reiterate as well, Kat, I don't know what you feel from a Korean, I guess wearing your more Korean hat, but I've always found in Korea that it doesn't matter if you make mistakes as a Westerner, but the Koreans really appreciate it when you make an effort to try. And even if you get 안녕하세요 completely wrong, or you get the Mudford director 님 completely wrong, they will really appreciate you giving it a try. And for me, in my role, I've seen a lot of Australians, when they make a presentation to a Korean audience, they might start their presentation with 안녕하세요, and that just sets the really nice tone for the rest of the presentation and demonstrates that they have made a little bit of an effort, even if the pronunciation is completely off.
Exactly, Liz. I think Koreans know that the language is not easy. Like 안녕하세요 is so how many syllables compared to hello. So just be assured that Koreans know that their language is hard to learn as a foreigner.
Absolutely. And there's just two more final points that I want to make on this slide before we finish. The first one is business cards. They're really important. Of course, it's a way of the Koreans also understanding where you fit in the hierarchy, because of course you're going to have your position on your business card. It is norm and an expectation that you do carry business cards and have them. So if you do travel to Korea or you're meeting Korean clients in Australia, please, please, please ensure that you have enough. The expectation is that you give one to everybody, not just one to the group. And my little tip here is as well, if you are serious about the Korean market and you do want to make an impact, go to the extra effort of having them translated into Korean on the other side. That's something very simple and quick that you can do, low cost, that just demonstrates, yes, you're interested in the Korean market and you have taken that time to do it. The last point here is just reiterating the focus of relationships, and in particular in contracts. Contracts are seen as the starting point rather than the final goal of a business. But Koreans are not going to get to that point with you unless they've built that relationship with you. So another example, just very quickly, if you do meet with a Korean and want to do business, it's unlikely that they'll do the business with you until they've had a few social interactions with you. So they might take you out for dinner 2 or 3 times, or take you out for lunch a few times to get to know you as an individual and to make sure that they like you and they can trust you before they will even start talking about business and then getting down to that point of signing a contract. So relationships, as we've spoken about before, extremely important. And if you can demonstrate that you understand the Korean culture, you're serious, your senior executives are serious, then that will go a long way in building that trust with the Koreans.
And just like that, we're at the end. I know it's the beginning rather than the end. But in terms of that overview of Korea, getting an insight into some of the cultural preferences and things that will be important for you as you think about kind of getting started with your business. Those are the things that we've got time to cover this morning. We have a series of country starter packs at Asialink Business. So if you'd like to drill down into any of the things that we've shared with you this morning, please do jump onto our website, download that Korean starter pack, and that'll just give you a little bit more info to work on. In terms of the rest of the morning, we wish you well as you move into starting to think now about getting ready to export and some of the more technical requirements as you explore Korea as a market for your businesses. You have the chance for a small break. So you've got a 5-minute break now, the chance to grab some water, stretch, and back here again at 12:25.
Welcome back, everyone, and onto the export commercial side of the webinar. Asialink did a great job there in terms of making you all aware of the cultural nuances and some of the insights, current insights on the South Korean market. Certainly, having exported to South Korea myself and helping food and agribusinesses go into the South American market, and in some cases grow their South Korean market, South Korean market. There are many factors there about the buyers and the engagement with the buyers that ring true. Just housekeeping very quickly. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded and that the link will be available to those that have attended the webinar to go back and watch over some of the important points and insights and hints and tips, and that the Q&A function is there for you to ask questions should you have any along the way. Questions that can be answered on the run certainly will. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Or alternatively, if it's a really big topic, we're more than happy to discuss your question after the workshop altogether. Normally, we would be in a room and we would have already shaken hands and exchanged business cards with two hands and politely said hello to each other. But we're in the pandemic world and everything is being delivered online. And so I've just put this up as an indication of the businesses and the people that have registered for this workshop. So quite a big mix. There are some personal products in there, along with foods and beverages, along with stakeholders as well. For those of you that don't know who Export Connect is, we help food and agribusinesses enter new markets by providing them with the strategies to succeed and the connections to make sales. We do this by providing market intelligence, competitor data, working on your unique pitch for each particular market, depending on the channel you want to get into. We also work with stakeholders such as Australian Organic Ltd to deliver capability building workshops and programs. So since founding just a little over 4 years ago, we've delivered more than 230 projects for 145 clients. We've helped companies enter and grow in over 20 markets. Last financial year, 55% of our projects and 60% of our revenue was from repeat business. And of the new projects that we deliver, 70% of them are referred to us. So quite proud of the fact that a lot of that our work has been validated through these indicators. And we've now delivered over 100 workshops. And more than half of them have been delivered online thanks to the pandemic. And another statistic there that we're proud of is that 100% of people that have attended our webinars would recommend them to industry peers. That's sort of a smattering of some of the clients that we've helped over the last 4 and a bit years. Now, in the delivery of our section today, I'm going to often refer to Helen Oh, who is the Trade Commissioner in Seoul for Austrade. So I'll just, now what we've done is we've pre-recorded her session and then we're just going to insert it at and her comments to certain questions at all the relevant points within the webinar. So this is Helen introducing herself.
Thank you for having me. My name is Helen Oh. I am Trade and Investment Commissioner at Austrade Seoul, currently looking after our agri-food trade and investment portfolio. So under the Australian Government's Agribusiness Expansion Initiative, which is a $72.7 million program to help our exporters diversify into different markets. Korea has been a popular market for exporters looking to diversify your portfolio. So yeah, we've been very busy working with about 80 to 90 exporters interested in this market, but we have capacity. We're happy to take on more work.
All right. So We're going to look at what market selection factors do you need to consider when assessing which markets you want to get into. And in those market selection factors, you need to consider the economic and demographic overviews. You need to think about consumer and channel category trends. You need to understand who your competitors are in market at a brand level and also at a country level. And then you need to create an evidence-based table that will then be able to help you rank each market that you're assessing. At least that's the thorough way to go about it. Then you have your scorecard and you make your decisions and you go along the way. Of course, know that there's always support to help you along the way. So what are the market selection factors you need to consider when assessing markets of opportunity? So you need to look at economic data. So things like GDP, GDP per capita, GDP growth rates. You know, is the economy heading in the right direction? What's the demographic of the market? Are there any sort of cultural or religious elements that your product specifically caters for, or your product does not cater for? What are the consumer trends in terms of their behavior around lifestyles, convenience, health, attitudes towards healthy living? What's the market size and the market growth prospects? And also, what is the category size and your category growth prospects? Are you in a category that's already large and growing fast? Are you in a category that's small and not growing at all? Or are you in a category that is small and growing fast? You know, you need to find that, where's your sweet spot? Which markets are the ones where you feel you can participate in the growth in the market, so that you're not seen as a replacement product, but rather one that the category can grow with on. What are the category trends? You know, and in terms of the product itself, you know, do you have the right size? Do you have the right packaging? Do you have the right claims? You know, in terms of channel trends, is your product suited to retail? Is it suited to food service? Is it suited to e-commerce? And what's happening across all those different channels? Who are your competitors on shelf? Where do they come from? What claims do they have? How much do they sell for? What pack size do they have? Are they on promotion? You know, are they on the menus? Are they on e-commerce platforms of supermarket chains as well as pure e-commerce platforms, or are they just on e-commerce platforms? Look at trade data to see which are the countries that you're competing against. So where is South Korea predominantly importing their breakfast cereals from, or their yogurt from? And what does that say about your potential and the potential for Australian products? Are there any market access issues? Are there any tariffs? Will the free trade agreement that Australia has with South Korea benefit you in any way against your global competitors? And what kind of certification is required? And certainly from a certified organic perspective, South Korea is not necessarily a straightforward market. So let's start off and have a look at some of the key indicators. So from a demographic perspective, the good news for Australians is that South Korea is predominantly an urban population. And that's important because urban population, people who live in urban populations, generally speaking, have easy access to modern retail and premium type retailers for which Australian products can conveniently be sold in. But in comparison to Australia, South Korea is double our population. Urban populations are fairly similar. Growth rate is quite poor, and we heard that in the Asialink presentation a little earlier. And the Human Development Index ranks it just outside the top 10%. So quite high though, that's still quite high. And Australia is in the top 10%. We heard that education is very important in South Korea, and as well, and we're seeing also a lot of effort being put around health. From an economic indicator perspective, South Korea's GDP is a little larger than Australia's. Its GDP growth rate as of the second quarter is almost quite similar to Australia. And the GDP per capita, though, is quite lower. So because their GDP is, while it's larger, the population is also nearly double ours. So there is still wealth and affluence in South Korea. GDP per capita of 28,000 is good. Not as high as Australia, not as high as Singapore or Hong Kong or the UAE or some of these other markets, but it's still quite high. And so there are still people that have disposable incomes and the propensity to spend. Ease of doing business is higher than Australia. And the Logistics Performance Index puts it again in the second percentile, which is still quite high, very positive. When we look at consumer characteristics, there are quite a few commonalities with Australians. So, Australians, are increasingly budget conscious. South Koreans are price sensitive. We're predominantly urban dwellers and, professionals. We're both experience seeking, reliant on word of mouth. We're looking for better quality type products. And even some novelty products are of interest. A lot of Australian product there are many attributes of Australian products that cater to Australian consumers that have shared attributes for the South Korean market. From an impact of the pandemic, and I'll only touch on this a little bit because we got quite a good coverage from Asialink. Inbound and outbound tourism has been impacted. We know there's been a decline in foreign investment, and we know that the unemployment rate was the highest in about 2 decades. What we do know also is that the pandemic was managed quite well by the South Korean government, and that it's experiencing a swift and rebound and recovery. And in fact, it's forecast to have stable growth for 2022. From a consumer perspective, we've seen South Korean consumers become even more health conscious. They were already trending that way prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated that demand for better for you type products. Let's see what Helen has to say about the impact of the pandemic.
The Korean government has always taken a management approach rather than a elimination approach. So currently in Korea, we're riding through our 4th wave of infections. So the daily confirmed cases are sort of ranging between 1,300 to just over 2,000. And we are under level 4 social distancing restrictions, but that doesn't mean an economic lockdown. We can still move around and eat out and things like that. It's just that contactless transactions are encouraged. 30% of the workforce are encouraged to work from home, but it's not mandatory. A lot of the on-premise venues are closing at 10 p.m., which is in a sense, a little bit restrictive because Koreans work a long hour. So by the time they finish work, it's, 7:30. So there's only really 2.5 hours to spend money or meet with other people. And given that a lot of Koreans live in those tiny little apartments, these sort of restrictions are getting in the way of some social development, some uproars about small to medium enterprises closing down because there's not enough government subsidies. But the Korean government is expecting a economic growth this quarter, about 2 to 2.5% amid the COVID pandemic. So they're managing well. It's just that there are lots of domestic conflicts that the Korean government needs to work through.
All right, so a lot of confirmation there of what we heard from Asialink. From consumer trend perspective, we know that South Koreans are now more cautious than usual about their spending habits, and that in fact, the majority prefer to save rather than spend. South Koreans are generally brand loyal. We mentioned that a little earlier, and we also know that technology and internet penetration is quite high in South Korea, which has helped in the increase in online shopping behavior. About half of purchased products, half of the products purchased through online are done from their phones. And we know that about 1/3 of South Korean consumers prefer to purchase eco-friendly and ethically, conscious goods. When we look at the channel review and we look at the size of each of the channels, so grocery retailing, food service, e-commerce, health and beauty, e-commerce in general. So this isn't actually just food and fresh produce. This is for all e-commerce products. Is the largest out of all the channels, which doesn't always happen. When we're reviewing so many markets across Asia and Middle East and even Western markets, e-commerce is not generally coming up as the largest channel overall. But certainly when you're looking at a food and fresh produce perspective, supermarkets still dominate. And when you look at supermarkets and hypermarkets together, they dominate. We've got food service. What's really interesting is in almost every market that we've studied, the compound annual growth rate for food service over the past 5 years is negative because of the massive impact of the pandemic on most global markets in 2020. Here in the South Korean market, while food service has definitely been impacted, it hasn't been impacted anywhere near as much as many of the other markets. Where we've seen the most suffering happen is in hypermarkets. Consumers are now less likely to travel a little further to do their shopping. They'd rather do it online or in their own community. And as a result, what we've seen is convenience stores benefit the most from a physical presence perspective, but that e-commerce is the big winner out of all of this. When we look at grocery retail trends, we know that supermarkets have performed better than hypermarkets, as I mentioned, because of the fact that they have that neighborhood, sort of convenience presence. And in fact, from a convenience perspective, convenience stores are the ones that have performed the best out of all the physical formats in terms of growth. South Koreans favor modern retailers now than your mom and pop, more traditional type stores, and e-commerce platforms and the better performing e-commerce platforms. Rising wealthy urban consumers have fueled the growth in premium grocer sector, and certainly we're seeing somewhat like Shinsaki Food Market. If you go in and have a look at those supermarkets, if you ever get the chance to travel, they're sort of like David Jones Food Hall, and there's quite a few of them around South Korea, Seoul in particular, and just spectacular stores with product from all over the world. What you see there on the right, generally speaking, the supermarket and hypermarket banners, including convenience, because convenience plays such a big part in grocery now in the South Korean market, that would typically stock Western imported products. From a food service perspective, the South Korean market, as was mentioned earlier, is currently on its fourth wave. Consumer food service has definitely suffered, and this has been as a result of the drop in tourism, and foot traffic in general is down with people haven't been locked down and working from home. But the established nature of home delivery services helped food service market cope with the impact of the pandemic. Convenience stores and limited service restaurants have done well because of their home delivery services. And what we're seeing actually is meal kits now being an attractive option for many of the food service players. When we look at full service restaurant breakdown, these are some of the bigger chains of the full service restaurants. In terms of cuisine, it's heavily dominated by Asian cuisine, followed by North American, European, and others. When you look at limited service restaurants, some of the main brands in that space are there on the right, and we see chicken focused limited service restaurants performing the best, followed by bakery products. Convenience is up there, burgers, and then it's a bit of a drop down to pizza and other type limited service restaurants. From an e-commerce trend perspective, and we heard it through the Asialink presentation, and I've already shared key elements of it there. But it's skyrocketed. E-commerce registered almost 30% growth in current value growth in 2020. Major retailers have responded by offering fast delivery services. So some are even offering delivery within half a day. And the aim there is to ensure or to give that perception that the products that the consumers are getting are going to be fresh. Let's see what Helen has to say.
So in terms of channel preferences, there's a lot more focus on retail sales rather than food service. Food service sector has taken a big impact from COVID, and a lot of food service sectors are actually pivoting to food delivery or retail delivery business as well. Koreans pivot very quickly, and they've done so very well. Another thing is a lot of Koreans are working at home, eating at home, cooking at home, ordering food online, buying their groceries online. So whereas before the online offline split was maybe 30-70, it's become more 50-50. And Korean freight and logistics infrastructure is so great that when you order something online via phone, whether that's your food for dinner or your grocery, it's delivered at your door on the same day or by 6 a.m. the following morning. And so that's the convenience and ease of transaction is attracting more and more Korean consumers to use online platforms and use more e-commerce channels. Home shopping is another distribution channel that's on the rise. So Korea's just gone from 5 prominent home shopping channels to 7 and a few more minor ones as well. And they really, the Korean food manufacturers, and also if you're new to market, it's a great opportunity to run an education advertisement for your brand for an extended period of time. The profit margin might be small, but it also gets your brand's name out there, which leads to online sales, which then leads to physical retail sales as well.
Great. And then in terms of actual, consumers going out to the supermarkets, we're seeing in many other markets, people shopping less but with bigger baskets, or people shopping in their neighborhood and not traveling further to buy the brands that they always used to, buy. Is that also the case in South Korea?
I would say less so because of the prevalence of convenience stores that are very easy to access in a lot of apartment complexes. And those convenience stores stock everything that hypermarkets and supermarkets stock, but just at a smaller sort of packaging. And so I think the transactions are actually looking smaller than usual, but more frequent. And those trends are also transferring to online transactions as well. So people are shopping more frequently because they now have the time because they are working from home or looking after their kids. So the weekend trips out to, the hypermarkets are becoming less popular, and the more once or twice a week shopping online is becoming more popular.
All right. So we've had a look at the key economic indicators. We've had a look at the key demographic factors. We've looked at consumer trends and we've looked at channel trends. So we now need to consider, what does our category look like in the South Korean market? Now, based on the registrants and just trying to find a mix of categories that are mostly represented, we're going to focus on this category review across yogurt, milk, breakfast cereals and sweet spreads. But know that the methodology that we take applies to all different categories. So first of all, at a higher level, when we look at organic packaged foods in the South Korean market, generally speaking, from the largest sort of categories, you would see is baby foods got a bit of value in it. Dairy has the highest value. Rice, pasta, and noodles has good value, and the growth rate is in some of these categories decent. But we've seen some other markets that have seen much faster growth rates. From a beverage perspective, we see juice, fruit and vegetable juice, and organic tea being the larger of the categories in the South Korean market that are certified organic, more so than soft drinks, coffee, and concentrates. So when we look at dairy products, there's a lot of excellent domestic product, and this is the same across all categories. South Koreans have excellent food manufacturing processes, and consumers trust South Korean products. So they wouldn't be coming to Australian products because they distrust South Korean products. It's because they're looking for products that may potentially be perceived to be of a better quality. Now, we know that functional dairy products are the ones that are showing the fastest growth, following that consumer trend for better for you type food. So when we look at the trade data, and this is based on a HS code of 040310, and so the HS code is a harmonized commodity code, is what's used by government departments to measure the imports and exports of product. Each country measures its own exports and imports, and so as a result, what you find is the numbers don't always add up. So you'll have export figures of certain products or codes out of Australia don't match the import code of the destination market. And that could be for a variety of factors, such as a lag in the time of when the information is reported. It could be that some of the product was re-exported. So it may be it landed in the market and then was immediately re-exported, but accounted as an import. It could be for a variety of reasons why they don't match. So the most important thing when you're looking at trade data is you're looking for things. So when we look at yogurt in particular, there are about $30,000 worth of imports as recorded by the Korean Customs Authority and ABS. So here the figures mostly, almost completely match. And when we look at where the South Korean mostly import yogurt from, it's from the US and then Europe, essentially, followed by New Zealand and then Australia, right? So Australia would be in the top 8. But the yogurt imports are not very big. When we look at yogurt from where does Australia mostly export its yogurt from, you see Southeast Asia tends to dominate a little bit. Hong Kong and China is in there as well. So, but it's mostly Southeast Asia, with Singapore being the largest destination market. When we look at milk products, so looking at a HS code of 0401, we see that South Korea mostly imports its milk from Italy, France, Europe and New Zealand. Australia again comes in the top 10. When we look at the top 10 destination markets of milk products or products within a HS code of 0401, China is the largest by far, and then mostly, then a bunch of Southeast Asian markets, Pacific Islands are in there as well. So and Hong Kong. When we look at breakfast cereal market, the subcategory within breakfast cereals that's doing the best would be granola and muesli. Again, aligning to that better for you type trend. Puff cereals no longer really appeal to the consumers. So they're looking for products that are more nutrient dense, and that'll give them more fortified. So there are some of the major brands in the South Korean market on the right. When we look at the HS code of 1904, which is what is usually used to measure breakfast cereals, we see that according to the South Korean stats, they import about $300,000 worth. According to the Australian stats, it's a little bit more than $400,000 worth. But again, we're sort of looking at the trends. Where South Korea mostly imports their breakfast cereals from are from the US, China, Belgium, Vietnam. So quite a bit of a mishmash between Europe other Asian markets, and North America. When we look at where does Australia predominantly export its breakfast cereals to, using the HS code of 1904, New Zealand dominates, followed by China, and then quite a bit of a mix between ASEAN markets, other North Asian markets, and Saudi Arabia. But we don't see, for breakfast cereals, we don't see South Korea in the top 10, nor do we see Australia in its top 10 imports. When we look at sweet spreads, this grew, and in particular, honey was the star performer. Honey has this perception of having healthier attributes, antibacterial type benefits, good for the gut health, and just, that all round sort of ancient idea around honey being good for you to consume, to apply as a topical cream for skin health. We also saw chocolate spreads benefit over the period, challenging jam and other sweet spreads as apart from honey, as a subcategory of growth opportunity. Some of the key brands are there on the right. Now, when we look at the HS code for natural honey 0409, we see that South Korea recorded nearly $2 million worth of imports from Australia, whereas Australia reported less than $750,000 worth of exports. So this is where we see the figures don't always match and don't always align. However, we're looking for the key things. And so we see that South Korea is in fact a very important market for any honey producer. It predominantly imports its honey from the US, followed by New Zealand, and then Australia is in the top 3. When we look at key export destination markets, China is the largest by a fair bit, followed by the US, and then North America in general, because Canada is up there on 5th. And then we sort of see a smattering of a few North Asian markets and a few Southeast Asian markets, and some Middle East markets coming in. So quite a wide range of markets that, and that shows that honey is quite a versatile product when looking at which markets to operate in. Now, when you're looking at your competitor review, or when you're looking at your market data, your key indicators, your trends, market sizes, category sizes, and all of that, category growth rates, you sort of, it's not always that easy to get that information, right? There are a lot of sources to leverage, and you may be able to get a little bit from here and there. It takes a bit of time, but if you're going to consider export and which markets you're going to enter at a evidence-based perspective, then that's what you really need to do. Trade Organic is putting all these slides and all these videos up, and having people will have access to it through the Australian Organic Ltd Trade Organic website. We know that Asialink have got their country reports. You could subscribe to some of the bigger information sources like Euromonitor and Global Data and Mintel. If you're members of MLA or AusVeg, you may have access to some of their information. You've got ITC for the trade data. Austrade has information and market insights and information at a high level. So there are places that you can go to look for this kind of information. We've created the Export Connect portal, which has all the key indicators that you would typically look for when pulling together your market selection tables and matrix. And that's going to be launched in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned, keep in touch with us, and then you'll be one of the first to become members. We have made a conscious effort to keep the cost really low to make market development accessible. We want businesses to be able to go about export market development the right way. So now that we've looked at the category and looked at the trade, so we've looked at how the category is performing and what the trends are, and we've looked at which source markets are our main competitors for the South Korean market. We now need to focus on who are the brands that we are competing with in the South Korean market. And so when doing that, if you can, and if you've got people that can go out in the market, you get them to go out and take photos and document all this information. Otherwise, you do it online, and you go to some of those major online retailers that are supermarket chains, convenience stores, as well as pure marketplace. We had a few banners and retailers listed on our slides a little earlier, and Asialink had a couple on their slides as well. And of course, if you're food service, you'd be looking at menus. You'd be looking at menus. Often they describe where the ingredients are being sourced from. In the very least, it gives you a feel for the types of ingredients that they use in preparing their meals that are listed on the menus. So you need to document the brand name, of course. You need to have an image of the product to be able to determine what kind of packaging do they use, what colors. You need to know about the product weight. Do they favor small sizes, large sizes? Of course, you need the price and you need to convert it. You need to understand the country of manufacture. You want to be comparing yourself as an Australian producer against North American product, European product, New Zealand product, other Australian product. You need to look at product claims. This will be able to help you to determine what your unique selling proposition will be and what your value proposition would be, value for money. Why would someone pay a little bit more for your product? It has to be because you're offering a little bit more than your competitors. What's the position in store? Is the product only available in where the category is, or is it available across the deli as well? Is it being promoted on the gondola ends? Is it being promoted at cash counters? Can you see the promotions happening on some of the screens that they have in supermarket stores there now, where they have some sort of advertising going on? Is the promotions happening on a social media level? And do you have the content and collateral to be able to translate the social media into the South Korean market? In most Asian markets, they have who the importer and distributor is, and that's really important for you to document that, because you may find some distributors of complementary products that you feel will be good for your product. Likewise, or conversely, you may find distributors of your direct competitors that you definitely don't want to be talking to, because you don't want to be, you don't want the distributor to be carrying two direct competing products. You need to take a category photo, have an image which gets you, so you can see, put all the brands in perspective on the shelf, and where would you best position yourself alongside which other brands. Mentioned earlier, looking at the menu. Once we can travel to markets, and certainly, living in Sydney, there's a chance I'll be able to travel to Seoul before I can travel to the Gold Coast. Ask wait staff about what are most people ordering, and why. And then what you need to do is compare across all the channels. So have a look at what you saw online. Have a look at what you saw in the supermarkets. Have a look at what you saw on menus, and start getting a feel for, all right, well, who are my main competitors? What is my proposition? How are we going to compete? So when we look at dairy products, this is normally when we do our competitor reviews, we look at over 100 brands that we document, and then we'll put them in a schedule and score them and rank them, and and get a feel for where the value is and where we can compete. So for the purposes of this exercise, we're just sharing a few examples so that you can get an understanding of some of the brands that are available in the South Korean market. So here we can see product that's coming from the US, local product. We can see a product coming in from Australia, Poland. So Poland has become a bit of a prolific producer of food and beverage products, because it's so much cheaper to produce in Poland than it is in some of the other European markets like France and Italy, UK. We've got some cheeses lined up here, and again, we're seeing product coming in from North America, from Europe. We see products that are, some that are very expensive, some that are not so expensive. With South Korea, tariffs can make a big difference in terms of how much your product sells for. From a cereal perspective, we're seeing product coming in, so it's a bit here from North America and from Europe. Germany is quite a big producer of breakfast cereals. From a sweet spread perspective, put the Capilano image here, and so you can sort of see. I mean, that's a pretty expensive product. It would never sell in Australia for $20. So there's an element of duty and sales taxes as well. We can see some Manuka product coming out of New Zealand, and then we've got some spreads in there as well. And so, how you would ordinarily document your competitors, and so here is sort of just again a very, very quick example, and just a snapshot of how you would go about doing it. You would document the muesli brands that you've seen in the market, where you saw the product, so which retailer did you see the product in, what's the weight, the price in the local currency. You have a formula for the conversion to Australian dollars. Then you would look at, and if you know, or if you can get to know, what are the margins in the market in terms of the retailer margin. So if there's a VAT, a retailer margin, a distributor margin, if there's import duties, what that multiplier would be, so that then you can try and guess what your competitors' products would land for. You then put in what your product would land for on a per unit basis and on a per gram basis. So you're comparing value for money based on per gram, not in terms of absolute products, because if yours is 300 grams and your competitor is 500 grams, then the expectation is that yours should be cheaper. Then you have the price differential. And then once you know this price differential, then you look at, well, where is our competitor? Where is the product manufactured? Is it a comparable market? What are the product claims that they have? Do they have more claims than us, less claims, about the same? What type of packaging are they using? Where was the product found? Was it on promotion? And you start being able to build a picture about what your unique selling proposition may be for that market. You have so once you do that, so you've got your key indicators, you've got your key trends, you've got your category information, you've got your competitor information. You then set some scoring criteria, and it'll be different for different markets, and it'll be different for different categories. And so some of it is going to be objective. So the GDP growth rate, GDP per capita, ease of doing business, logistics information, performance index. Then when you look at the category data, so category sales, when you look at the import data, and when you look at tariffs, these are all objective. So these are hard numbers that you plug in. And then you'll have your subjective numbers, which are, okay, well, how do you analyze the trends? Were they favorable for your product from consumer trends, channel trends, category trends? And then from your category review, how do you feel you compete in that market? Do you think there's a good chance for you to compete in that market? And so you score whether that's favorable or not. And then you do that, and let's say you're doing, in this instance here, we know we've got like a study across, what's that, like 7, 8 markets. And then you end up telling all the scores, and then at the bottom, it'll tell you from an evidence-based perspective, where should your product go? Now, we put a very high emphasis on competitor and opportunity review, because in there, we also factor in things like where our best connections are, where where can the best support be for accessing buyers in that market. How receptive are buyers in that market to new products? How long does it take to get a product registered in that market? So, a lot of thought goes in behind putting all of this together. Now, getting into export can be a difficult. It doesn't need to be harder than it needs to be, if that makes sense. So you do need a bit of information. You do need connections. You certainly have to set a budget, and you certainly have to set plans. But there is support available from Austrade through their EMDG, and we're just going to hear a little bit now from Helen about how Austrade can help. FIAL has its Australian Food Catalogue, and each state government agency is doing one thing or another, whether it be grants or going global programs. Export Finance Australia can offer some export finance where you're going into a market and you need a bit of cash flow to help you produce the product for that market, but the bank is not willing to give you the money. Export Finance of Australia, depending on certain criteria, may be able to underwrite that. So there's a lot of support available to help you get into the export markets. So let's hear from Helen, first of all, on what are the categories of opportunity that she feels are hot at the moment in South Korea.
The hottest product category would be wine. Korean consumers traditionally are after sort of the Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon from Australian wine regions, but they're also branching out to try new varietals, some of the colder climate white wines, and also sparkling from Australia as well. Particularly imported wine sales in Korea has grown by 102% year on year. And also there's a growing popularity for zero alcohol or low alcohol beer and wine as well. So we're getting lots of different buyer-initiated inquiries on those. The second most popular would be premium packaged food and beverages that can be serviced, that can be distributed to online food delivery or food service channels as well as retail. Because Koreans are eating and cooking more at home, they're looking to spend more money on their groceries. So they're looking for those high quality, safe products they can feed their family with. Also, because people are drinking more at home, they're looking for those, what they call anju, those small snacks that go with your wine or beer as well. So a lot of hypermarkets, they're looking to introduce those anju ranges in their catalogue. We're also getting lots of inquiries, supply and demand inquiries on dairy. Usually for dairy sector in Korea, there are two companies that have dominated the market for a very long time, but they don't really do UHT milk in Korea. And so Koreans that are looking to feed their children, school-age children at home, with sort of smaller packaged UHT milk is looking for Australian products as well.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. On the fresh side, is there anything in particular, like you're saying, in terms of whether it be meat or fruits or vegetables?
Yeah, so on the fresh side, red meat, which has Australian beef and lamb, are going strong, especially in the retail package sector. But more and more, we're seeing food manufacturing companies looking to include Australian red meat as a food ingredient in home meal replacements and meal kits. So MLA Korea is actually pivoting their sort of marketing target audience from the consumers in retail sector to those food manufacturers as well. For fresh products, of course, Australian table grapes, mangoes, citrus, navel oranges and cherries are seen as premium quality, and they sell not just in hypermarkets but also in department stores. And because Australia is known as a good supplier of green, safe and fresh products into this market, we expect the fresh horticultural sales to at least double compared to this time last year.
All right. And off the back of that, I then asked Helen what advice would she give to Australian food and agribusinesses wanting to export to the South Korean market, and specifically for certified organic brands. So let's see what Helen had to say.
Organics has had this, love and hate relationship in Korea. The mainstream Korean media have sort of had this narrative of pitching organic products as overpriced, less value for money about 10 years ago, but the landscape has moved very quickly, and the younger generation of consumers are now looking to buy the more eco-friendly, healthier alternatives, integrating whole foods into their meals. And so I wouldn't call it an organic movement, but there is what they call vegan movement in Korea. So consumers are looking for products that are plant-based and also products that are good for you. And the vegan label isn't strictly as vegan as we know it in Australia. It's more vegetarian, flexitarian. The healthier options are known as vegan. Between Australia and Korea, there's no mutual certification recognition, which means if you're certified organic in Australia, you will need to get a Korean organic certification to enter the market as well. There are a couple of ways for you to enter this market as a new to market product. One is to commence trading as an organic brand and go through the Korean organic certification process before you enter the market, which could take anywhere between 3 to 6 months, depending on how COVID situation is in Australia. It could take a little bit longer. But that means that you can charge a little bit more premium on your products, and you can start supplying your product into department stores and hypermarkets first, and then move on to e-commerce channels and convenience stores. Other way is for you to start trading in Korea as a non-organic product, but really market your brand as the healthier option to the existing product offerings in the market. Test the market demand, test the consumer appetite, and then if you are sure of the market demand, going through the organic certification process in Australia for Korea as well. I can't say one option is better than the other. It really depends on your business strategy and your product's quality and competitiveness in market. But yeah, either option is good, and we're happy to use Austrade's badge of government to connect you with appropriate importers.
And so, speaking of Austrade, such an important vehicle for so many businesses to open up new markets. Can you describe a little bit, for those that are not aware of Austrade services for food and agri, can you please describe the services in terms of, the Accelerate program and in terms of EMDG?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting with the agribusiness expansion initiative, and what we're doing for different industries, we have introduced what's called group services. So those market briefings and market intelligence reports that can service many clients in the same sector. We run those market updates quite regularly, at least once a quarter, for different sectors. So please keep an eye out on our website to join those market briefings. The Accelerate program is just a fancy word for customized one-on-one service. So one of our onshore global engagement managers will be in contact with you to understand your business strategy, not just focusing on Korea, but what other markets would you like to enter into, and coming up with a coordinated market entry approach, and engaging with those of us offshore in market to see what sort of importer connections or special market briefings we can deliver for those clients. And it's been hugely successful. Even this financial year, we've seen at least 10 exporters sign new contracts with the green importers. So if that's something that you're interested in, please get in contact with Austrade Onshore Office and we'll walk through the process with you. In terms of EMDG grants, there's been a few changes from the previous iteration of EMDG. It's gone from grants model to a reimbursement model. And so, I mean, you can go on our website to see more details. It's divided into 3 tiers now. So depending on where you are in your export journey, we can help you with the initial market research, reimburse those amounts, or we can proceed with actually helping you with the strategic shift of your business into new markets. In terms of other sort of commonly known business services for agri-food exporters, we have opened a digital front door for you to study different markets and market access issues, and just general market overview in Korea and other Asian markets, in fact, our global markets. So that's another thing you can access at export.business.gov.au. Excellent.
And so Helen was very generous with her time, and really appreciate her sharing her insights. So this brings this part of the webinar to an end. If we could just ask you to just share your thoughts in terms of a poll, in terms of what your overall experience was for just the Export Connect session. So just about the market and market selection factors, the insights, pulling it together and getting an understanding of what's going on from a consumer channel and category trend perspective. And would you recommend this session to peers that are interested in developing export markets? Now, for those of you that have attended the, all the webinars, so I think we've delivered 7 markets as part of this Asian program, and 3 other markets prior to this, UK, Sweden, and Germany. You would have been able to get all the insights and actually start compiling a market selection comparison tool, especially if we were covering the information for the categories that you're from. But yeah, if you could just get your poll responses in, I think let's just about another 10 seconds for everyone to be able to get their selection in. And then following this, I'll be handing over to Josephine, who's just come up. Yeah, I think that's most of the responses are in now, so that's excellent. So I will say thank you, and I'm going to come back at the end of Josephine's session. And so if there are any questions on what I've just delivered, and any questions following Josephine's presentation, we'll both be available to answer those. So stop share. And Josephine, over to you.
Thank you, Najib. Thank you very much for all that information. My name is Josephine. I'm the Technical Officer here at Australian Organic Ltd. Some great insights that we got from Asialink and Export Connect. To put it into context, Liz mentioned that South Korea was Australia's 3rd largest trading partner. For organic agriculture, as part of the Australian Organic Market Report, South Korea represents 6% of organic exports, and these are mostly concentrated within the grain sector. So there's definitely a lot of room for organic businesses to explore South Korea as soon as you get over the technical barriers or market access to allow you entry into that country. So there are 2 main steps to getting your organic products to South Korea. The first is getting them out of Australia, and then the second part is getting them into South Korea. This is a fully regulated country when it comes to the term organic, so I will take you all through that. So the export market of Australian and organic and biodynamic goods is regulated. They're considered prescribed goods with the Export Control Act 2020, and it's illegal to export prescribed goods without the approval in the form of an organic goods certificate. So the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment is the Australian government authority responsible for certifying Australian food and agricultural exports. This is conventional, organic and biodynamic. And they have highlighted, the 6 certification bodies that are able to offer you an organic goods certificate for you to be able to export your product overseas. This is within the organic goods rules per se. And within this, it specifically references the national standard for organic and biodynamic produce. So if you are an Australian producer and have only had a domestic market and you're potentially certified to the ACOS or the Australian Certified Organic Standard, this unfortunately isn't sufficient to get your product to South Korea. So for you to be able to export your product to South Korea, you need to be certified to the national standard for organic and biodynamic produce. And within this, it excludes, cosmetics and pet cosmetics. But just talk to your certification body in case you have a product that might come into multiple categories. And the organic goods certificate, as mentioned previously, this is a consignment by consignment based certificate that you need to get from your certification body. So this isn't the same as your organic certification where you have the annual audit as such, even though with the Korean standard that will be required. But the organic goods certificate, very separate to organic certification, and just make sure that you fill out the paperwork properly, otherwise you will have to pay for an additional organic goods certificate. So as I said, anything, if you are exporting anything from 10 kilograms or 10 litres and over, and it's organic, you need an organic goods certificate. So that's how you get your product out of the country. You got your organic goods certificate with your certified organic product. How do you get it into South Korea? So in 2013, MAFRA decided to change their system where they initially accepted products that were certified to overseas organic certification schemes. But they've changed this in 2013, whereby all products that came into the country that were organic had to be certified to the Korean standard. And so, they have equivalency with the US and the EU, so this can facilitate their market access. But what this means for Australian producers is that on top of your Australian organic certification, you need to certify to the Korean standard. So this typically means an additional audit, up to 2 audits if you're a meat producer. This means, you have to comply with all the, not necessarily additional, but slightly different regulations that are part of the organic standard. And because they have such stringent import requirements, it means that once your organic product is in Korea, you don't necessarily need to change your logo, such as the Bud logo, but there are some other labelling requirements that we'll discuss. So, the free trade agreement since 2014 has really been great for conventional produce, but in terms of organics, you still have to register, to the certified organic Korean standard. So there are still some additional costs there for organic producers compared to conventional. So ACO, they're accredited to the South Korean organic standard, and NASA can facilitate markets, but they aren't accredited as such. And I guess the biggest deterrent with South Korea for certain producers is that your whole supply chain needs to be certified. And so if you are just selling one commodity, single ingredient, this is reasonably simple and not too much of an additional cost. But if you're selling a multi-ingredient processed product, where sometimes your sourcing requirements might change, it becomes a little bit more problematic. So as mentioned, every product needs to be certified, and you also need to give what some would say an exact percentage recipe of their processed food. But I just want to remind everybody, if people get nervous about this, then that they're giving away the recipe of their product. But you're just showing, the Korean standard or the Australian Organic certification body you're with, that you're conforming to the percentage requirements of organic produce, and they're not allowed to do anything with this either. So within this, group certification is possible in terms of the paperwork, but it still means that every location requires a separate audit. So you still can't jump through too many hoops at the same time, unfortunately. So if you can source ingredients from countries with equivalents to South Korea and have the certification for that, that might facilitate it a little bit. But unfortunately, with the high shipping costs at the moment, that's also very difficult to justify for products. So within the labeling, ingredients that aren't certified to the Korean standard, even if unless they're from, countries with equivalents, they may not even have organic or even organic ingredients used on the label. So, if you send your amazing organic product there, but you don't conform to those standards, there are quite large legal ramifications, up to jail and heavy fines for misleading consumers with fake organic products or not being certified. So when we look at sort of the more commodity-based things, there's a few things that stand out, Interestingly, South Korea is the largest export market for short ribs when it comes to meat. A huge amount of short ribs go from the US and Australia to South Korea. So I will definitely have to try to see what they're doing with all that. In terms of the meat, as I mentioned, if you are a livestock farmer, there are biannual audits for the Korean standards. Also, when you're exporting products, there are health and sanitary certificates that also need to accompany your organic goods certificate. And the best way to check this is to go to the MyCall website to make sure that you are satisfying all the export requirements and import requirements for that country on top of the organic certification per se. So, with the free trade agreement, it also meant that the tariffs on certain products didn't end straight away. So, there's a 40% tariff on beef that's decreasing over the next 10 years. The same on lamb is also decreasing. But, those will eventually be eliminated and hopefully not stop you from trying to access this market. When it comes to dairy, again, you need that health certificate along with your OGC certificate. And there were initially a lot higher tariffs on certain dairy products, especially, butter at 89%, which was huge to start with, but that has also been decreasing per se. So in terms of fresh produce, bananas are the most imported fruit into South Korea, and we have, a lot of organic banana growers here in Australia. So hopefully, that can be some market insight. And the best way, to keep an eye on this, Austrade have great updates and MyCall. So just when you know what type of product you have, you can also see if there are any specific labeling requirements or anything like that I haven't covered that you should be aware of when you're exporting your product. So in terms of like the additional paperwork for the South Korean market, you know, there is the National Agriculture Quality Service Certificate. So this typically accompanies products. Sometimes the OGC can be used, so check with your certification body and your counterparts in South Korea if that is sufficient. The other thing that we need to be wary of is the labelling requirements. So you do need a Korean language label on your products. And typically, you know, this again is product specific. So it's different when it comes to meat, it's different when it comes to dairy, it's different when it comes to fresh produce. So just remember to go to the MFDS website and have a look at your product-specific labelling requirements so that there aren't any smaller details that will stop you from getting your organic products into South Korea. So, in summary, as I said, fully regulated market. It's amazing what they're doing, you know, the MAFRA, yes, they've got organic, they've got no pesticide, they've got, you know, no chemical fertilizer categories as well. So if you're in conversion, you know, you can maybe explore these categories for South Korea and then work towards organics as well. With the certification body, there's quite a few things that you're going to have to check, given that they're going to facilitate or organise your market access through ACO or NASA. You know, this typically takes 2 or more months. So just be aware of the time requirements of accessing international markets before you agree to any contracts. You know, every time you send a consignment, you need the organic goods certificate. Check if you need the NAQS. You need the compliant labelling for your products on top of, you know, the organic certification, and just make sure that you have that excellent company contact with your contacts in South Korea. And I hope that the first part of this webinar was a great chance to learn more about how to successfully develop those contacts. Michael and Austrade are great sources of information for South Korea, given that they do have a lot of market importance. And in terms of the organic certification for to the South Korean standard, there's an English version. It might sometimes be a bit difficult to understand, and there aren't that many changes between that and the Australian version. It's just the fact that we don't currently have equivalents, but we're definitely working towards it. So we come to sort of the end of the Trade Organic at the moment, and if there were any questions, we would be more than happy to answer them at this time. For those of you, the Masterclass Vietnam on the 12th of October is the last Masterclass within this Trade Organic series. We also have Biosecurity for Organic Importers on the 28th of September. And so this is for the changing regulations in terms of the Capra beetle. We're going to go through modified atmosphere treatments and organic ways that you can control pests in your large grain, legume, so forth imports. But did you want to say anything else, Najib? Did you have any questions that you have gotten?
No, look, no questions. And usually through these workshops, I think we share so much information that that we get the questions generally after the workshop. But we're here now and ready to answer any questions if anyone's got any. So just fire them through the Q&A section.
And otherwise, you know, we'll send out the link to the slides. We'll send out the link to the webinar for YouTube. And so if there is anything else. Okay, we have one question. Any work being done to increase the number of accredited Korean certifiers in Australia? If you're talking about, you know, typically you would fly a Korean certification officer over from Korea. But that has been very problematic with COVID. So I think that's very difficult for us to control at this point in time. But I do hope that when things open up, that that will become more accessible. And if you have any issues with that, I do believe that they have been doing some virtual audits. But that's just something that you're going to have to check with ACO and NASA to see what is possible in what time frame, because I understand doing a virtual audit as an initial audit is always quite risky and not always approved, unfortunately. But okay, second question. Okay, are there products that can use the term organic without being certified? So because the Korean regulations are fully enforced, it means for at least food products, any product that has the name organic on it has had to go through the import regulations with the NAQS certificate, being conforming to the Korean organic standard, or from a market that South Korea has equivalence with. So if you are a company and you get your product into Korea and you repackage it and it's not certified and you put the label on organic, you know, you can go to jail for up to 3 years and get a 30 million, whatever the Korean currency is, I apologize, fine, but it sounds better, you know, when it's 30 million. So you really need to be careful and make sure that you conform to those restrictions. Otherwise, it's unfortunately not looking very good for you.
And I might just add there, Josephine, as well, that generally speaking, when you're looking at all Asian markets, North Asia, Southeast Asia, it used to be a long time ago that you know, you could send your product in, you would claim organic, and you know, they may or may not ask for the certification. They'd bring it in anyway. But now all the good importers and distributors in Asia, and you know, retailers for that matter as well, if you're selling direct to retailers, any claim you have on your packaging, they'll want you to substantiate it. And that in particular includes certified organic, or saying that your product is organic. They're going to want to see the certification. So whether or not you want to take a risk on a regulatory angle, it's unlikely you'll find a buyer that'll want to take a product that claims it's organic without it being certified.
Yeah, great behind the scenes market input there. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I hope to see you all again the 12th of October for the Vietnam Masterclass. Thank you very much, Najib and Export Connect and Asialink. And we will see you next time on the Trade Organic platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine.